Hameed Almaas was born in Kuwait and later studied at the University of California in Berkeley. His work inquires into the psychological and spiritual aspects of human nature. Hameed's process of exploration led to the creation of the Ridwan School and in the founding and unfoldment of the Diamond Approach. He is the author of 20 books, including Keys to the Enneagram, How to Unlock the Highest Potential of Every Personality Type, Love Unveiled, Discovering the Essence of the Awakened Heart, and The Unfolding Now, Realizing Your True Nature Through the Practice of Patience.
Hello and welcome to the Collective Trauma Summit 2022. My name is Thomas Hubl. I'm the convener of the summit. And I have the deep honor and the real pleasure from my heart to welcome Hameed Almaas. Welcome, Hameed, and thank you for joining us here.
Well, good to be with you, Thomas.
Yeah, I'm so lovely to be, just to feel you and be with you here. And I'm curious, since also I'm not fully informed, and maybe nobody is really, about how you, like, how life brought you to do what you do today. Like, what was the initial either calling, life circumstance, whatever experience in your life that you felt like spiritual realization, like the whole path of realizing is your calling? Was that clear from the beginning? Like, did you came into this life and you were on track? Did something put you on track? Was it a combination? How, maybe you can speak a little bit to how the flame got ignited in you.
Well, yeah. It wasn't clear at the beginning, although I was there. Mm-hmm. And from the beginning, I wanted to know reality. I wanted to know what is the truth about things, about everything. So I thought at the beginning, the way to get at, understand that is through the sciences. So I became a scientist. I, studied physics, mathematics, things like that. And at one point, I remember I was in my graduate studies, went to the dining room where all the professors and graduate students, research people sit, have their lunch. I was sitting there and I looked around and had this interesting perception. I saw big heads on very little bodies. As I said, that's what's it like to be this line of work, And I said, no, that's not what I want. I don't want to be that way. And that's when I realized that the truth I'm looking for is not going to happen through the objective sciences. And that, took me, gradually inward more and more. And I had, like near-death experience too, that probably was instrumental. So it's not like I wanted to be enlightened or I wanted to fall. It was happening, indirectly, then became more direct recognition. That's what I want to find, So I embark on whatever is available around.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so, as your own teaching work progressed, I mean, you're doing what you're doing for a long time, and what I really appreciate about your work is that there's so much attention on depth, on a path that we need to walk. It's not a quick fix or a quick solution. It's really deepening and falling in love with life and the spirit more and more. And then there is there's an attention to the depth of the spiritual practice. That's what I really honor about your work. And there's no over promising. It's very, very naked. So that's really beautiful. And so when you see yourself, like from the first years when you were teaching and with people, and now, what would you say were the things that evolved over this time? Like, what do you see is your own flowering in your teaching, or how the teaching is flowering through the time? And maybe what was added that wasn't there at the beginning? Maybe you can speak a little bit to the evolution of your own teaching journey.
The teaching happened as a result or consequence of inner discoveries and revelations. I worked with several teachers, and then at some point, after working with those teachers, I started having experiences that I was not learning about from the teachers I was with. And they were beginning to happen as if on their own. Something was opening up. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like a big experience. I mean, although I had before that big, enlightenment experiences, but I thought I was enlightened, turned out I wasn't. It was just an experience, But then things started to show up. And I was practicing in the sense that I was meditating, and at the same time I was attentive and exploring my experience. And experiences started appearing, and the main one, well, the main discovery at the beginning was the discovery of presence. What is it? What my being is like? What does it mean to experience true beingness? And that was sort of a different kind of spiritual experience than I've had before, because the more palpable fullness, a palpable medium that I recognize as my nature. It's like pure consciousness that is as a medium. It wasn't just capacity of consciousness. And recognize that, and then from that consciousness or that presence began to change and manifest different things. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I didn't know what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So when I learned about presence and recognized presence for what it is, that's when I started working with people, with individuals, with students. I didn't know yet I have a teaching. I thought I'll just teach them about presence and being present, who they are. But then it turned out that was, after first few years, that what's happening is not just my own experience, that there's a teaching that is emerging and using me as a vehicle.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And it wasn't just for me, because some of the things that's happening, I didn't need myself. My student needed them, because I was fortunate. I had good upbringing. Life circumstances were generally positive, and which not many people have that, these days. So, as a result, I will be experiencing things. Some I was interested in, useful for me. Some that was not. I didn't need them. That's when I realized it's not just for me. And it took a while before I recognized this is really a particular path, particular teaching. And I'm a custodian and a mouthpiece for it. And it continues till now, even though, most of the time I don't experience myself as an individual. Or I used to see myself as a mouthpiece, as a servant of the teaching, an expression of the teaching and all of that. I'm now of the very essence of the teaching. what I am, what the teaching is, are not two things.
Right.
Yeah, and the teaching is not separate from being, from the true nature of spirit, of our spirit, or true nature of reality. So it is not just a path; it is a particular path, and it uses it. It seems as if it made a choice, or I was the sort of the natural, vehicle for it, because of my upbringing and my education. Education came in very handy for this particular path. That's why it has the specific details are important, and the precision about the experience and the insights are very important, because in my schooling, that was the training of my capacities, my mind. So it values precision, values exactness, and values verification, all of that, which all became part of the path, used by the path.
I love it. It feels so true with like how the teaching comes through. It's not the ownership. It's like it's something that comes through, and it's beautiful how you described it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why sometimes people say Hameed's teaching. I said, it's not my teaching. It's not Hameed's teaching. I could never be able to make up a teaching like that. I'm not smart enough. I mean, the teaching is so profound, so things I didn't know anything about, and revealing more and more mysteries and secrets, and an amazing thing about human being and reality that there's no way that I could have made it up. Because many people think, I integrated this with that. I said, I didn't integrate anything. I was just aware of these things. I was studying these things, and the teaching used up whatever I had in the mix to express itself.
Right. No, that's exactly the beauty. And you're also describing in your own words like a deeply emergent process. What it means that through the not knowing in the presence, it's like that's allowed to come forth. That has a free space to come in. So that's a beautiful description of that emergent process that comes through you. I love it. Yeah. And so, and I'm sure you came across this many, many times. There is a bit of a duality sometimes between focusing on realization or doing therapeutic healing work, and like what's the relation between a path that focuses on realization, healing work? There's no difference. There is a difference there. Like, how does this show up in your work? I'm sure many people that come to you also come with this kind of question. I'm going to therapy. Yeah. I'm working on the past. I'm working on realization. So maybe you can speak to that whole topic a bit.
So when I first started getting engaged and learning about myself, I was doing things like growth work, all kinds of therapies, all kind of, whatever was available there to understand myself. And I studied, psychology, psychoanalysis, and different schools of psychology. And those all became integrated into how the teaching formulates itself. So large part of the path is the recognizing the difficulties in the way of spiritual nature manifesting. And the difficulties, a lot of it is our neuroses and our patterns, our rigid pattern, our conditioning, the suffering and the pain in it, the anxiety and the fears and the conflicts and the abandonment and the pain, and that become an important part of the path is not to go around that and experience something wonderful, but to understand that and work it out. so that it goes all the way to full understanding, which then dissolves it, basically. And as it dissolves, that becomes a transparency to the inner being. So that is sort of a healing kind of work. It's a psychological healing. And the healing happens actually because it's a spiritual path, is understanding or, the psychological patterns and the difficulties in it, which includes studying the history of it, genesis of it, how it started, and dealing with the old unconscious pains or trauma or stuff like that. And that is a big part of the healing. But then the other part of the healing that's complete is the arising of qualities of spirit or being that are needed to complete that healing. Healing is not complete if it is just psychological. I mean, the psychological helps things move, help things get better, but doesn't eliminate totally the patterns. For the pattern to completely dissolve, presence of spirit need to emerge in a particular quality or dimension that turns out always is the precise thing needed. Like if somebody, for instance, feeling lack of connection, lack of loving connection, and feeling sort of disconnected, and all the way from, usually that happens from early child all the way to relationship with their mother or mothering person. And you work with that and you feel the loss and the absence and the pain of it and the longing and all that. And that's what psychotherapy does. And so this path is different from psychotherapy because it does that. However, by understanding that space opens up a quality of being that fills the heart that make us feel it is the very essence of connection. It is the love that makes connection possible. It's like a good mother is supposed to be is right here in the heart. And that is really the fullness of the healing then. And then there's no more looking for connection happens naturally because I'm connected with myself. And it is, since this is a quality that has to do with loving and enjoyable and nourishing connection, attuned to possible connections that I have or people have with each other. And that, of course, opens up the field of recognizing people, how disconnected they are, and all the manifestation of presence or absence of connection or limitations of it. It's a big thing for human beings because a human being needs this relationship kind of, and not just relationship, but a relationship that has an intimate, nourishing connection. You see, and the answer, the full answer, is in the spirit. So the healing happens on both sides. Understanding the psychology, which helps sort of experience, acknowledge, and discharge the emotional things that are hidden. Much of it is difficult. And then the arising of the true connection that fills the heart, that fills the atmosphere, that can go all the way to a boundless love. That feels the love that, if I recognize it from my perspective, it feels it is bathing everything. But that doesn't mean everybody will experience that. I'm aware of that. Many people are still feeling disconnected. So that's an example of how this path works.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Beautiful also how you describe the dissociation and the separateness if it starts to to integrate more, we touch again our deepest core or essence, and it becomes more, it fills us from within. And so when we also in the therapeutic approaches, especially in the last 20 years, maybe the whole notion of trauma and the neuroscience of trauma and the psychology of trauma, like also that what you said at the beginning, you saw your fellow students and you saw big heads and small bodies. Like trauma often gets treated through somatic practices also and deeply embodied practices. And can you speak a little bit like how is the approach, the diamond heart approach, and your teaching addressing trauma as such? Is that a question? Is it any way embedded in your teaching in other ways, just called differently? Like how do you relate to trauma as such as a phenomenon?
Well, trauma is a big topic, first of all. I'm glad that there is more awareness of it in the culture at large, and how prevalent it is, which people didn't know. I didn't know at the beginning how much I didn't. I mean, I had traumatic experiences, but they didn't leave much traces in me. So for me, I never experienced myself as a traumatized person, although I had events that many people would have been disabled in a big way. But that has to do with the kind of love I had and things like that. But so trauma is, first of all, I like to see trauma as a particular set, a particular region of human suffering. It's not all human suffering is trauma. You know, some people think all of suffering trauma. In that case, trauma loses its meaning then, because trauma is for something very specific, being studied by very specialist people in terms of neuroscience, in terms of body sensitivity and all of that. Like, you know, Peter Levine, the clerk, and all those people, you know, they studied it in detail and they have developed methodologies to deal with it that is different from regular psychotherapy. So that's why, you know, doing therapy is not necessarily working on trauma, although many therapists now work with trauma because of how prevalent it is. Now, the work I do, because it deals with human conditioning and whatever the obstacles that are in the way, it encounters trauma. I mean, some people have trauma. So the work deals with trauma in the sense of recognizing it and working with it as long as it's not intense enough that it needs a very specific kind of skill. Because my work hasn't developed the skills that the trauma specialists have. And because I didn't study that. And also, there is trauma work is developed in such a way as a psychotherapeutic modality. And since my work is spiritual work, and in this country, spiritual work cannot do therapy. So I don't do something that is specifically the domain of psychotherapists, which way you need special certifications to special education. So because of that, I didn't try to develop it that much, because I knew if I do that, I won't be able to do the path. You see, that's part of it. Part of it is that, you know, I ended up training teachers at some point. Our training in the path takes about 7 years or so. Trauma training will take several years more. So it'll be too long. So what we do is that we are aware of trauma as it arises in terms of its symptoms. If it is light trauma, we can work with it just as we do with being hurt or being abandoned and stuff like that. When it becomes to things like dissociation and frozenness, stuff like that, that then I recognize it is not within the realm of this teaching to deal with it. And what I do is we refer students like that to specialized people to work with. And we found that very useful, because the individual who is in spiritual work cannot really progress much as long as they are still held back by trying to avoid the trauma. There's both a limitation and sometimes a disconnection that happens. So I learned, and many of my teachers have learned, to recognize it. We do specific training at least to know what's happening, and to see whether it is within our capacity to deal with it or not. If it isn't, if it needs a real specialist, we refer people to the specialist. And what I found is that, of course, people go and work with a therapist, one kind or another. There are many kinds of trauma therapists, and sometimes it takes several years for individual to really go through sometimes many years. And they go through it enough that that they can be open enough to be able to open to the spiritual nature and to be able to handle it. Because if one is traumatized, as in some kind of dissociation or some frozen place inside them, they can't handle the spiritual energies. It will bring up the fear and whatever and be difficult for them. So that's one thing about how this path works with trauma. But the other thing I wanted to say about trauma is that, as you know, Thomas, throughout history, spiritual path in general, when a teacher has 80 or 100 students, only maybe a couple become realized. The rest of them, they learn, they're fine to be around, but not everybody get it. And I think a big part of it is because of trauma. Because most of those people, I imagine in the old days, more people were traumatized than now. Because there were wars and exploitation and violence all the time, everywhere. That was the human condition. So I imagine many people were traumatized, but spiritual teaching didn't know about that. Didn't have the knowledge about it. They didn't know how to deal with it. It wasn't because they were more interested in more universal principles of spirit and transcendence and all that. So they didn't know, they couldn't recognize it, they couldn't deal with it, and as a result, practices were not there for people who are traumatized. Wouldn't work for people who are traumatized. And I think that is an important reasons why throughout history, spiritual teaching were not that successful. In the sense of the teacher being able to illuminate most of their students. Rare, and that doesn't happen. Usually few. Then, and I think a big, there are many other reasons, but I think one important reason is the fact of trauma that wasn't known, and now in the last few decades, half a century, we have more understanding specifically what is trauma, what does it do, what are its symptoms, and how to approach it, and then the specific attention and sensitivity needed to deal with it, and how it needs to be personal and attuned, all of that. The spiritual teachers were not like that. A Zen master isn't trying to be attuned and sensitive. They will hit their student in the head. If somebody's traumatized, they probably close down more.
Right. But what you're saying is so much, it resonates very deeply. I think it's deeply true that without an understanding of trauma, that's at least a major reason also why that is that way or was that way. I think that's deeply true, what you said now.
Yeah, it continues till now. Most spiritual teachers don't know about trauma. Don't deal with it. Some of them have heard about it. There is no such thing. They might not recognize its symptoms, or station, and they don't address it anyway. In our teaching, it's true. We don't do trauma therapy, but we have an understanding of it, a recognition of it, we'll deal what we can. If it falls within the parameters of teaching, meaning the connection of the psychological constellation to spiritual nature. That's basically what the paradigm. And but very intense, deep trauma is outside the realm of the teaching, really.
Yeah, I think so too. That it's that in many, especially only transcendent focused practices, that was long time, and maybe is still now not so in the awareness. But I think also that there is a change now. It starts to become more and more part of, which I think is very good, as you do, and it also, what I appreciate about your work and the work in your communities, that it's that there is an emphasis on that spirituality doesn't become a bypass to the issues that we have in our lives and in our world. And maybe you can also, because I think the trauma speaks to that, but also like a kind of a psychological sophistication is part of that. That we see that there is spiritual practice to resource our way to meet the world, but that it doesn't lead to the fact that it helps us just to avoid our issues in life and then just hang out in some kind of pleasant states, but not be able to connect to our rooted or embodied life. And maybe you can speak a bit to that also, because how we recognize that our practice becomes a bypass, what we can do that it becomes actually an integrated spiritual path, like that it integrates with the world, and we can also live our life in the world well.
Yeah. You see, this is part of really many teachings, except it's not emphasized very much. I mean, there is the looking at teaching as two phases: realization and then actualization. That's how many, like Zen talks about it that way. Realization is to open up to your true nature, whichever way it appears, as suchness or transcendence or awareness. And then after that, how to live with that, how to live your life from that, how to live it, how to express it in life. It's part of most teachings. However, the second part is not easy.
Right.
In fact, many teachings see it as it takes longer than the first part, because it needs the transformation of the whole body and mind and all of that. Because especially most traditional teaching didn't deal with these things before. They got their awakening, and then they have to work through things. My teaching, the down approach, we work with that from the beginning. So the realization, actualization go hand in hand. They're sort of side by side. They're not one and then the other, you see. And so, because this path, one of the principles of it is to be in the world, but not of it. Mean to live life as a human being, but to know that my inner being is not physical, is not part of this world. It's something completely pure and timeless. To be that, but live a human life, relationship, work, creativity, all of that, not just to hang out in some kind of spiritual heaven. So like, I'm not a guru because I don't do that. I live my life. I visit my friends.
Right. Lovely.
I don't just sit home and people take care of me. I take care of my own business and things.
Right.
People who help me, I don't know everything about finances, but I have my, people who help me with these things. But I still aware of it. I'm part of dealing with my life. I'm married, and have kids, and I have, and I appreciate friendship. And so, although I know I am beyond this world, what I am is something most of the people I talk to don't know. not aware of, but I live with them. They're my friends, my family, and whatever goodness from this true nature expresses itself as sensitivity, compassion, love, generosity, strength, firmness. All of that is expressed in day-to-day kind of activities and interactions. And I think that's the full realization anyway. Full realization is happening integrated with life, not separate from life.
Right.
Yeah. And I think also, I think especially the Indian model of looking at spirituality is the idea of karma, reincarnation. That because of karma, you come into this world, and the idea to finish with your karma and leave and never come back. So that model, which is both in Hinduism and Buddhism, does not really give value to the actual life, that the life itself has its own value. It's not here just to get enlightened. I mean, Buddhism said we should be thankful we're born as humans, because we're lucky we're born, because that's the only place we can enlighten. But that's it. It's a place to get enlightened, not a place to live.
Right.
You see, that living itself is not seen as its own value. So for me and for this teaching, living is not, I'm not here just to get enlightened and then finally leave this world at some point. I'm going to leave this world at some point. But while I'm in it, living in this world has its own discoveries, its own value, its own dimensions, its own kind of experiences, and an own learning that cannot happen in any other world. We're not in this world just because we can't be enlightened, but there are things here we can learn. We can't learn any other way. We need the physical body to learn, for instance, to develop our mental capacities to the kind of precision. And we need a brain. Without it, we stay sort of amorphous. You see, the consciousness is not sharp, not precise. So being in a human physical life is significant for spiritual realization. But also the other side is, I don't see the two things as separate. Transcendence and embodied living are two sides of the same thing, really, for me.
I love that. I love that also how you bring the emphasis on the living itself. Because sometimes when I look at trauma, like one way to see trauma is postpone the experience. And like that it's something is too much now. We need to shut that down, package it. But in a way, in the trauma healing, we reactivate this and bring it back into the central stream of our being. And so like that some spiritual traditions actually created, without knowing trauma or collective trauma, exactly what you said. So this resonates so deeply with me when you said, yeah, but where is living? Because living is there for living also, not just to get somewhere. And in a way, the getting somewhere, for me, is a symptom of a systemic traumatization, that we are a little bit ahead of ourselves. Like even we want to be more developed than we are, is a way not to be here. Because in a way, trauma says, here, in this moment, in this place, it's not good for me.
Right.
So the movement out...
Yeah, most people want to run away from it, basically.
Right. And even the trauma response, its intelligence is not to be here.
Yeah.
So, but if that becomes a systemic agreement, then not being here is better than being here. And a lot of, I think also your work, that's why I appreciate it so much, it's about grounding on many, many levels into the presence of being here. And that's why what you said before, like to also change that kind of attitude towards living, that in the presence of living, there is something precious. It's not just the suffering that we want to get away from, through enlightenment, but it's actually a deep synchronization with life. I think that's such a important message. So it deeply resonates.
Yeah, sometimes people ask me, for instance, how do I prepare for death? I usually my response is the fulfilled life.
Right.
If you live your life in a fulfilled way, fulfill it means to live it as fully as it can be. That is the best preparation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hameed, I see our time. The one last thing I would love to ask you is, it seems like there are very painful realities like racism, like a Native American genocide, or other issues in other countries that are similar and just in other cultures. And we see a lot of dissolution of certain structures in the world that might scare many people, that might create kind of uncertainty. I think, as you described, if you are more and more grounded in your true self, so maybe that creates a resilience exactly in that time, and that it creates some resilience to meet change, like now, or maybe also disruption. But for many people, it might be scary, uncertain. It's a time where insecurities rise. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that. What's like, if many of our listeners now look for, okay, what can I do to be in a time of kind of collective change on the planet? And also when times get more rough, maybe with climate change, you see many more of this kind of disruptions. So, some people need like an inner guidance or inner strengthening, or how to deal with
So
that.
obviously having access to your inner resources, especially spiritual resources, which mean you're grounded deeply, not just in your body, but beyond, grounding that is independent of what's happening in the world. If you know yourself that way, these things are easier to take, easier to deal with. But not many people will have that access, you see. I work with our students so they can have that, but not, spiritual schools are never a big popular thing, most of the world is not doing spiritual work. Mm-hmm. But I think spiritual connection is the best support to go through the stormy times, to stay solid and capable and not get too scared, not get too, because I think it is difficult. I think you're right. I agree with you. It is going to get more difficult. Mm-hmm. I think first, being grounded in one's being and knowing oneself in a more certainty. So it's not being part of this group or that group, and which is always in flux. And also having the capacity how to deal with these things as they happen, because I think an actualized spirituality gives us the capacity to live in this world more effectively. Times of peace, it appears as more enjoyment and more, fulfillment. Difficult time is more capacity, more intelligence, more clarity, how to, live our life. But also, we shouldn't forget to have a good time.
And Italian ice cream, it seems.
Yes. I remember when we were
there. Right. So, Hameed, thank you so much. I feel deeply honored to have this conversation with you and to be in this space that you transmit with you. And thank you for being part of the summit. I love to further collaborate with you. I'm honoring what you do in the world. So thank you
I
very much.
appreciate you doing all of this too, this big summit, many people, and the topic that is very, more awareness of it now. So it's good to have input in it.
So thank you.
Yeah. Good to be here with you, Thomas.
Likewise.
You can learn more about Hameed and his work on the website diamondapproach.org.